It is my pleasure to invite the third speaker, Professor Patrice Boudet from Universite d'Orléans. Professor Boudet is a specialist in the history of astrology and magic in the medieval West. He will speak to us about the critical edition of the medieval French translation of 4 astrological treatises by Abraham ibn Ezra, on which he and Professor Sella collaborated.
And thank you very much to invite me. Yes, it is now some 20 years since I first became aware of famous Shlomo Sella's book, Abraham ibn Ezra and the Rising of Medieval Hebrew Science. And more than a decade since I was able to get to know Shlomo in person in Paris during a seminar at the University of Paris, invited by Gad Frodenthal. In 2014, I wrote a letter of recommendation for his application to the Institut d'études avancées in Paris. And in November 2018, during one of his visits to France, I invited him to Orléans for a seminar during which I had the joy of welcoming him and his wife, Leah, with the greatest pleasure. I have an excellent memory of this seminar in Orléans, where Shlomo gave an extraordinary performance that enthralled all those present at the seminar, including students and colleagues who knew absolutely nothing about the life and scientific work of Abraham ibn Ezra. His enthusiasm, his human warmth, and the extreme clarity of his speech won everyone over, and I remember this privileged moment with emotion. You all know the extent and quality of Shlomo's work on the astrological writings of Abraham ibn Ezra in Hebrew and in Latin translation. What is a little bit less known is that a significant part of these treatises was translated into Old French in 1273 and shortly thereafter. Translations made in the house of Henry Baat in Mechelen, now in Belgium, and at his request. And that translations are largely, that it is largely through these French translations that these treatises were then translated into Latin and spread through Europe in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I refer here to the Shlomo's article on this topic, the impact of Aguin le Juif French translation on subsequent Latin translation of Abraham ibn Ezra astrological writings, published in Jewish Quarterly Review 2 years ago. And of course, the 2 magnificent posthumous volumes by Shlomo, Abraham ibn Ezra, Latinus, Henry Baat's Latin versions. These Hagin's translations are preserved in 2 manuscripts at the BNF in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. One from the end of the 13th century, and the other one from the end of the 15th century. This translation had been spotted for a long time, but only the first of them was published by Raphael Levi and Francisco Cantera in the book, The Beginning of Wisdom, an astrological treatise by Abraham ibn Ezra, published in Baltimore in 1939. This publication is useful, but old and outdated. It concerns only 1 text out of 4, and Shlomo has undertaken to start from scratch with the help of his own critical editions of the Hebrew originals and of the Latin translations made at the end of the 13th century by Henry Batt and Pietro d'Abad. Thus was born what can be called the Hagin Project, a critical edition of the 4 treatises translated into French by Hagin in 1273 and shortly thereafter, namely The Beginning of Wisdom, the translation of Sefer Reshit Chokmah, the Book of the Judgments of Nativities, the Sefer HaMoladot, the Book of Elections, the Sefer HaMivrahim, and the Book of Questions, Sefer HaShe'elot. Each of these critical editions had to be accompanied by a specific English translation, not only to make Hagin's text comprehensible to a wider audience than that of old French specialists, but also for scientific reasons that have to do with the nature of these translations. This is what Shlomo told me in an email of December 2021. I quote, "I'm finding the French text of the Commencement de Sapiens," that is the beginning of wisdom. I'm finding the French text rather different from the Hebrew counterpart, full of glosses, divergent readings, additions, omissions, and also literal translations, and translations that avoid a literal rendering and give the meaning of the Hebrew word. All this requires adequate documentation translation. I'm also finding places where the manuscript of the 15th century fills up lacunae in a manuscript of the 13th century, or gives better renderings than the earlier manuscripts. Since the earlier was not Batt's working manuscript, but a copy of the original manuscripts, this means that both manuscripts were based on an earlier, now lost manuscript. All this is indicating that the critical edition of the French texts should be accompanied in facing pages with English translations, which should be rather different from the English translations of the Hebrew relevant texts. I'm ready to do this. What do you think about that? Says Shlomo. Of course, I was agree with Shlomo, but I was also a little afraid of the difficulty of the task. But Shlomo went into his work with his usual enthusiasm and efficiency. See, for example, his email of mid-January 2022. Dear Jean Patrice, I have now completed a first draft of my edition of Commencement de Sapiens, the beginning of wisdom, collated with the Hebrew source text. Raphael Levy, the editor of the 1939 edition, made a great job in editing for the first time the French text. But his fundamental shortcoming is that, as you may see in the notes to his edition, he relied almost exclusively on the 2 available French manuscripts and did not pay attention to the Hebrew source text. I'm not sure whether he was sufficiently familiar with Ibn Ezra's peculiar Hebrew, says Shlomo Levy. My edition, in sharp contrast, collates thoroughly the French text with the Hebrew source text and allows to appreciate, first, Hagin's Le Juif modus operandi as a translator, secondly, important variations unseen by Raphael Levy between the 2 available French manuscripts which emerge from the collation of the French text with the Hebrew. This is why I believe my edition is better than Raphael Levy's, and deserves to be accompanied by an English translation, documented by linguistic notes. The collation makes clear that Again le Juif's translation is in some important parts markedly different from the Hebrew source text, divergent readings, glosses, additions, etc. Even where Again le Juif follows slavishly the Hebrew, the French literal translations are very interesting from a linguistic perspective. As an illustration, I attach a sample with my edition of the introduction plus the first chapter of Commencement Sapiens, etc. And Shlomo sent me a first version of his critical edition of the Commencement de Sapiens, Beginning of Wisdom, on March 10th, 2022. I sent him back a corrected version of this edition on April 24, and this is his answer, I quote, "Dear John Patrice, I'm very happy to receive your corrections to Commencement. I will study them and incorporate the corrections in the following days. Please tell me if you have time to continue with Nativité, the book of Nativities. Otherwise, this can wait. I'm now translating into English the French text of Commencement to make readers aware of the spatial flavor, peculiarities, and minutiae of Hagen's work. The English translation is meant to stick as close as possible to Hagen's French. I'm offering a literal translation of almost every word in the French text. The result is fairly different from the English translation of the Hebrew text. This job has turned out to be much more difficult and slower than I expected. Naturally, when you translate, you discover and see many things that you did not see before." On June the 6th of last year, I sent him a message where I said, "Dear Shlomo, I realized that our collation of the manuscript French 1351, that one of the late 15th century, is sometimes insufficient for the edition of the Commencement Sapiens compared to that of the three other treatises which I recollected in a second time." And I gave some examples of this problem. Shlomo answered immediately, "Dear Jean Patrice, it is really opportune that you have realized that manuscript L, French 1351, requires to be thoroughly checked against P, the oldest manuscript, regarding Commencement. Please find attached the last version of Commencement for your consideration," etc. And some days later, "Dear Jean Patrice," I quote, "please find attached the last version of the English translation of Commencement. A brief explanation of the methodology of the translation follows. Any remark about this methodology will be most welcome." This is not a standard version which attempts to render elegantly the meaning of an undialing text, to make readers aware of Hagen's modus operandi as a translator of Ibn Ezra and Hagen's attitude towards Ibn Ezra's text. The current English translation is meant to stick as close as possible to Hagen's French. Therefore, the English translation avoids metaphors and offers English literal renderings of virtually every French word or phrase. All the cases of translation appear in the sigla, but three main cases deserve to be explained, etc. In total, now, Shlomo has completed his edition of the Commencement Sapiens. He sent me in May and June 2022 his critical editions of the other three treatises translated by Hagi, and I sent him back a corrected version of the whole. I have all of this on my computer, as well as his English translation of the Commencement. I think that he has entirely translated Hagin's Nativity, treatise on nativities, the treatise on nativities into English, but he has not sent it to me. But I don't think he has had time, unfortunately, to translate the elections and the questions. It remains so to make these translations and to complete the formidable work undertaken by Shlomo, which could lead to a beautiful volume that could be published in honor of his memory, a volume in which I would like nothing more than to collaborate as far as I'm able. But it is a very difficult work, which requires complementary technical and linguistic skills. So I need help to achieve this with your help. Thank you very much indeed.